The Prime Minister was out and about toward the end of July trying to heap more pressure on the Greens to wave through the Housing Australia Future Fund Bill, also known as the
centrepiece
of Labor's housing policy. The PM's decided that he'll reintroduce the bill unamended to the House of Representatives when Parliament returns in early August.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
His announcement was gaslighting deluxe.
Our Housing Australia Future Fund. Now this is something that Labor has a clear mandate for.
Look, I'm going to have to stop you right there. I'm not sure you do have a clear mandate. While Labor may hold a majority of seats in the lower house, it's fair to say that less than 1/3 of Australians actually gave the party their first preference in the 2022 election. It's also fair to say that Labor doesn't hold a majority in the Senate. In the Senate, Labor has fewer numbers than the coalition, which means they need the support of the Greens to pass any legislation. In case it's not clear, the government does not have a clear mandate to just push through whatever it wants. If anything, it has a clear mandate to work with the Greens to get things through, something the government seems to have forgotten here.
It was the centrepiece of my second budget reply when I was leader of the opposition. We campaigned on it in the lead up to the election for 2 years. And today we have everyone from charities to shelter to welfare organisations to builders to community housing providers all saying that they want the Housing Australia Future Fund put in place. Now BlueCHP by itself has, they had 3,000 they said a few weeks ago, they're now up to 3,500 dwellings that they have planned, ready to go if this bill is just passed through the Senate.
Okay, BlueCHP may well do good work, but let's be honest here. They were established in 2008, and since then they've delivered around 2,000 homes. They've delivered 2,000 homes over a 14 to 15 year period.
You have the Coalition, One Nation and the Greens in the new coalition, a coalition saying no to additional public and social housing, saying no to improving housing affordability.
To frame it this way is intentionally misleading. Albo knows full well that that's not why the Greens haven't waved it through. But you'll never see him address the substance of their resistance in public, because to do so would highlight the inadequacies of the bill itself.
Our plan for 30,000 additional social housing dwellings over just 5 years, but a permanent stream of income with at least $500 million being invested every year is a practical one.
Sure, it's a practical one, in that it practically won't scratch the surface of what's needed. A recent report from Oxford Economics Australia, commissioned by the CFMEU, highlights just how inadequate the HAFF is given the scale and extent of the problem. Albo describes his plan as delivering 30,000 homes over 5 years as a practical one. Well, let's put that into some context. The Oxford Economics report puts the current housing shortfall at a nudge over 750,000 homes, and are predicting that to continue to grow an additional 26% over the next 18 years. The Oxford Economics report estimates that a nominal figure of $511 billion is required to close the gap by 2041. Now contrast that figure with the $500 million that the HAFF will disperse annually. Hold on a second. It's there. Can you see that little red line? Hold on, I'll zoom in. Can you see it now? It does seem a little undersized, doesn't it? And if the HAFF disperses $500 million a year, by 2041 it'll have provided $9 billion in funding, still less than its initial upfront investment. So when I say the HAFF will not practically scratch the surface of what's needed, this is what I'm talking about.
We will reintroduce that bill in the House of Representatives next week, and it will be debated and passed through the House of Representatives in October because we want to see this legislation passed.
Yeah, they did, and this probably best summarises the government's approach to the whole thing and just how seriously they are taking negotiations. They reintroduced the exact same bill without any of the amendments made the first time around. That's right, the bill Labor reintroduced on the 2nd of August caps annual HAFF spending at $500 million a year, with no guarantee that it will spend anything in any given year. I realise that the previous amendments may well be reintroduced via the Senate, but for me this underlines just how Labor are trying to play this. I'd argue if they were going into this thing in good faith, that they'd have at least reintroduced the bill with the amendments that had been previously agreed to. It'll be interesting to see how Labor chooses to play it from here. Maybe Albo sees a double dissolution trigger as more important than improving a shoddy bill. Time will tell, I guess.
The Coalition, of course, don't really support public and social housing. They never have. They never have, and at least I guess they're upfront about it.
I guess that's true.
For the Greens political party that say that they care about social housing, that they care about affordability, to be blocking this is quite absurd. And the arguments that are put forward about this, I heard them again this morning.
There are a lot of arguments put forward as to why the HAFF is inadequate. I don't reckon he's going to address them all.
Saying this Housing Australia Future Fund will provide for speculation on the stock market.
Because yes, that's exactly what it is. It's borrowing $10 billion and investing it on the stock market. The reality is, any form of investment carries with it a level of risk. The Future Fund manages that risk to a degree by spreading the investments around. While it's important to recognise that the Future Fund more often than not provides a positive return, the truth is it's not guaranteed. There are years where it has made a massive return. And yes, it's true, there are years where it has actually made a loss. When the Greens are quoted as pointing out that the Future Fund made a loss last year, they're correct. But let's move past the Future Fund for a second and look at two of the smaller funds that are closer in value to the proposed HAFF. First, the Medical Research Future Fund, which itself is a good counterpoint for anyone trying to argue that the HAFF is somehow protected from future political interference. Since its inception in the 2015-16 financial year, the Medical Research Future Fund has made a positive return each year. That's great, right? Well, sort of. The average annual return since it kicked off is 4.1%, and over that period the returns have ranged from 0.1% all the way to 10.9%. Let's consider these figures in the context of the HAFF. With the HAFF we've got $10 billion. $500 million of that is dispersed annually. That's 5%. On top of that, there will be the repayments on the initial $10 billion loan, as well as the various fund management fees and costs. Conservatively, let's say they are only being charged a 1% interest rate on that loan. In the most recent 3-year reporting period available at the time of preparing this, the Future Fund spent approximately 0.2% on direct costs and another 1.4% on look-through costs. So if under the HAFF bill, the government borrows $10 billion and then invests it, at least $500 million of the $10 billion is dispersed, $100 million is paid in interest on the loan, and then $160 million is paid out in fund management fees and other costs. So that's around $760 million a year that comes out of a $10 billion investment. So to ensure that the fund at least breaks even each year, it would need to average an annual return of 7.6%. So if, like the Medical Research Future Fund, the HAFF only makes a 4.1% return on that initial $10 billion investment, well, let's just say it's not cost neutral. Let's take a look at the returns of another future fund that's within the same ballpark as the proposed HAFF. The Disability Care Australia Fund is worth around $15 billion. Since its establishment in the 2014-15 financial year, its average annual return comes in at around 1.5%. And yep, last year it went backwards. Think about that in terms of the HAFF.
I don't know if the Greens realise what superannuation funds do as a centrepiece of our savings system in this country.
I reckon they probably do. Does Albo know why comparing super to the HAFF is stupid? Super is money put aside and invested for the future. The HAFF needs to address a problem the country has right now, and this is a problem that's only going to grow worse as we wait for the HAFF to deliver a return.
Prime Minister, are you willing to use this legislation to trigger for a double dissolution election?
Well, I don't anticipate that there'll be an election this year. But quite clearly we have a mandate for this. We want this to be passed. The way to ensure that this doesn't provide a trigger is to pass the legislation. And the fact that the Greens are saying that this is about politics, this is so that if the bill's passed then they won't be able to door knock people in Labor-held seats, is actually what they have put in writing.
I did a whole 20+ minute video analysing this article he's referring to here, and needless to say, Albo is proving quite fond of misrepresenting what that article had to say.
Well, I say that Australia deserves better.
Yeah, we do.
We have a clear mandate on this.
Housing Ministers have been developing a proposal to take to National Cabinet around strengthening renters' rights. Will a national rental cap be considered by National Cabinet?
No, because what we're not doing is abolishing the states, which is essentially what the Greens say. We'll vote for your bill as long as you abolish the states, or in some cases abolish the private housing market.
No, that's not what they're saying at all. What the Greens have been asking the Prime Minister to do is coordinate National Cabinet to come up with a solution that addresses the rental issues, which quite obviously feeds the demand for more social and affordable housing.
So what we've said to the government is they don't have a majority in the Senate, and we expect them to negotiate in good faith to work out a plan that spends a little bit more on public and affordable housing and coordinates a plan to put a cap and ideally a 2-year freeze on rent increases, although we're willing to negotiate that.
Heck, even Waleed gets it.
You do hold the biggest megaphone in the country, though, and you do have the money to create incentives, which is what the Greens are actually asking for you to do. They're not asking for you to determine state policy, but rather to incentivise it. So before you get...
Well, they are actually.
Well, right, yeah, they want $1 billion. They want $1 billion on the table that you can then, the states can then use to incentivise it. But the question, I wouldn't mind getting an answer to Steve's question.
The problem with that, Waleed...
Yeah, go on.
The problem with that, Waleed, is that we put $2 billion on the table for states and territories in June.
No,
they must have missed
specifically
that.
on the question of rent caps.
That was an incentive.
This is to incentivise rent caps. So
was an incentive.
Sure, not for rent caps though. So I'm just interested in the question.
That was an incentive for planning.
Yes,
that's planning. What we need to do.
Sorry, Prime Minister, I just want to get.
The key is fixing planning.
This is the point I'm interested in. Are you philosophically opposed to the rent caps and the idea of capping rent increases? Are you philosophically opposed to that and therefore won't use your megaphone for it?
What I want to do, no, Waleed, that's not the question.
You know, I think it was, actually.
It's an unfortunate reality for the Prime Minister that chairing National Cabinet forms part of his job description. And the whole purpose of National Cabinet is to get states and territories together to collaborate on national issues. To suggest that the government can't do what the Greens have put on the table with respect to coordinating National Cabinet is a lie, as it's been done before. There's a precedent. In December 2022, National Cabinet came together to coordinate the energy bill relief plan that capped the price of gas and coal, as well as finding $1.5 billion to provide targeted bill relief for households and businesses. When it comes to rent freezes and caps, we've already started seeing some murmurings from states in this space, particularly in Victoria, and Victoria have previously frozen rents during the dark COVID times. It's also worth pointing out the country is essentially all red when it comes to state and territory governments, so coordination shouldn't be all that difficult. So yes, the Prime Minister could most definitely do what the Greens are asking for. Unfortunately for renters though, it's simply a case of...
We're not doing that. But this bill was expected to sail through.
Albo finally says the quiet bit out loud and summarises why there's been so much argy-bargy on the HAFF bill. It's been fairly obvious that the government just expected this to be waved through. They weren't expecting to be challenged on it at all. They definitely weren't expecting to be called out for an inadequate response to what's a massive nationwide issue. This is probably the big reason why they've spent most of their time attacking the Greens, rather than the Greens' arguments.
You didn't rule out completely the double dissolution election. Can you rule it out now? Can you put the Australian public at rest that they won't have to go to the polls?
Well, they won't be going to the polls this year, but we're determined to get this legislation passed. We want it to be passed. The way in which you rule out having a double dissolution election is to have no triggers. That's the way that you rule it out. I want this legislation to be passed. I can't be more serious. I put this at the centrepiece of my second budget reply. There were some stories written at the time saying, why is the Commonwealth Government, or the alternative Commonwealth Government, putting housing at the centrepiece? Because we know that the lists have been growing. In states like New South Wales, there was less social housing at the end of the revolving door government of the coalition from O'Farrell through Baird, through Berejiklian and through Perrottet, than there was at the beginning of that period.
I can understand why I mentioned New South Wales and not Victoria here. Because despite Victoria investing $5.3 billion to build additional social housing almost 3 years ago under the Big Housing Build, as at the 30th of June 2022, there are only 70 more social houses than there were 5 years prior.
Here we're talking about a supply mechanism that's available right now that's being denied.
I'm not sure why the media won't pull him up on this. The Housing Australia Future Fund bill just sets up a funding mechanism. If you're unclear on how it would actually work, here's the Housing Minister stumbling her way through explaining just when and how this work would all be done.
When will the first home be built?
Well, that will depend on how fast we get the fund through the Parliament.
I beg your pardon, in relation to this particular fund, assuming that you do get it through, when would the first home be built?
Well, it'll take a little while for those returns to come through, so the sooner we can get the fund through, the sooner we can get homes on the ground. These types of plans and projects take quite a while to get off the ground, and so as soon as the money's able to flow, we have houses going under construction straight away.
And just briefly, how long do you think that will take?
Well, it will take a few months to get the returns from the fund. We anticipate probably in the first 12 months we'd get a return. Guaranteeing a $500 million disbursement from 2024 to 25 each and every year. $500 million will come out from 2024, guaranteed disbursement.
Available right now.
A $500 million disbursement from 2024 to 25 each and every year.
There was something that the ALP's favourite villain said last week that didn't really get picked up on.
The ACT Labor Conference just passed a motion, the Labor Conference, calling on the Labor government to commit to the Greens' proposal to spend $2.5 billion a year on public and affordable housing.
Yep, this is true. The ACT Labor Conference did pass a motion to call on the federal government to commit to an additional investment of at least $2.5 billion a year. For what it's worth, ACT Labor also called on the federal Labor government to address the design flaws within the HAFF as well. On top of that, we've also seen the CFMEU come out and offer what could only be described as a lukewarm endorsement for the bill. The kind of endorsement you'd have to think may not have been forthcoming with the CFMEU not a major ALP donor.
The federal government has obviously laid out the Housing Australia Future Fund, which we do believe Parliament should pass as soon as possible.
Putting all that aside, the rest of the National Secretary of the CFMEU's speech at the National Press Club was a fairly damning indictment on the federal government's lack of ambition when it comes to addressing the scale of the problem.
Victoria has the Big Housing Build program. Queensland has the Housing Investment Fund. There's the Together Home Transition program in New South Wales and the growing and renewing public housing program right here in the ACT. And these are all worthy, positive initiatives. But let's get this clear. They are nowhere near sufficient to close the gap. Given the importance of this problem, we are being way too timid, and I think all of us here know that. As soon as I got this job, I commissioned independent economists at Oxford Economics Australia to take a deep look at this. For a start, they confirmed that even with all those new programs I just mentioned factored in, we're not going to come close to closing the gap. As we sit here today, we are about 750,000 social and affordable dwellings short of where we need to be. It is a gap that's been widening rapidly. In fact, it's 18% wider than it was a decade ago. And even with all that's been promised by governments lately, with all of those initiatives, it will still grow by another 26% by 2041. So what do we need to do to close the gap? Well, Oxford Economics finds we would need to build about 52,600 dwellings a year between now and 2041. Theoretically, we could do this faster and hit the target quicker, but there are constraints on construction capacity, land release and so on. So 2041 is a feasible target, and if we operate on that timeframe, and if we factor in how the cost of construction is expected to increase over the forecast period, we will need an investment of $511 billion between now and 2041. That is $500 billion.
The fact that Albo continues to refer to the HAFF as the
centrepiece
of his government's housing policy really underlines the government's lack of ambition in tackling the problem. Reissuing the same bill is an interesting move, and what does it tell you about the Albanese government? That they think the HAFF is enough? That this is as good as it'll get? The double dissolution card is one that I think Albo is unlikely to play.
Oh wait, he's bluffing.
Is his plan really to force the country back to the polls because of a stubborn refusal to do better? I mean, that's a really tough sell. He's not going to want to pull the trigger anywhere near the voice referendum, particularly if it doesn't get up. And if the Australian summer is anywhere near as bad as what we're seeing overseas at the moment, then he's probably going to want to avoid that period as well. Particularly given his government's lack of ambition on the climate change front and propensity to carry on with business as usual. That'd push the possibility of a double dissolution election out to mid-2024, and by that time any goodwill that Albo may have built up for simply not being Scott Morrison will have all but evaporated. Look, the government may be able to apply enough pressure on the Greens for them to crumble rather than actually negotiate.
All in.
Which for the record is what people like David Pocock are actually asking the government to do. If the Greens do back down and the bill is passed as it currently stands, I think it'll be a great shame for the country and will really underline how, when it comes to the issues that matter, the current government is lacking the political will and ambition to really drive meaningful change.
Australia deserves better.
Yes, we do.